It's actually a great day to have this program on the Christmas bird count. I didn't plan it this way, but it fell on December 14th, which is the beginning window of when the National Audubon Society sponsors the Christmas bird count. And this year is the 123rd annual Christmas bird count. It's an early winter bird census. Counts take place during one day in an established 15-mile diameter circle. Every bird is counted. Teams of birders go out and they count every bird, not just the number of species that they see. And then there's a compiler at each location that tallies bird totals. And I mentioned the 123rd annual count this year. It's the longest running community science bird project in the US. And next. It all began in 1900 with Frank Chapman, who was an ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History. He was also editor, next slide please. He was editor of Bird Lore, which was the official publication of the newly established Audubon societies. Next. And in the December 1900 issue of Bird Lore, he proposed an idea for a Christmas bird census. Next, please. And the idea came as an alternative to what was known as side hunts. And Chapman wrote that it is not many years ago that sportsmen were accustomed to meet on Christmas Day, choose sides, and then hie them to the fields and woods on the cheerful mission of killing practically everything in fur and feathers that crossed their path. Next, please. And he proposed a new kind of side hunt in the form of a Christmas bird census. And the hope was that the readers of Bird Lore would go out on Christmas Day and send their report of their quote bird hunt to Bird Lore, where the totals could be compiled. Next, please. And in 1900, that first bird count, there were 25 counts with 27 birders. Most of the counts took place in the Northeast US, but also a sprinkling here and there throughout North America, one in Toronto, Canada, another in Illinois, Louisiana, Missouri, Wisconsin, Colorado, and California. A total of 90 species were seen that day. Now, of course, the first Christmas bird count and the first Audubon societies were promoted mostly by amateurs, although professional ornithologists such as Frank Chapman were also involved in getting those Audubon societies started, getting the Christmas bird counts started. So let's go back in time and we'll talk a little bit about who were these professionals and who were these amateurs. Of course, in the early 19th century, you had artists such as Alexander Wilson, next slide please, and John James Audubon produced these great works of art on the birds of North America. Next slide please. And then beginning in the mid-19th century, next, ornithology as a profession emerged in the US. It was in an era that saw increasing specialization of scientific fields. So ornithology was not alone. There were many scientific fields that began college programs and specializations. And the ornithologists, they continued the work that Audubon and others had started with identifying and describing North American birds. But these ornithologists were systematic ornithologists, and that is they described and classified species and subspecies based mostly on the study of dead birds that filled museum cabinets. They were laboratory ornithologists. Next, please. And among the most prominent ornithologists of the day was Spencer Baird, Assistant Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He was not just an ornithologist, but he had other natural history interest as well. But if you would ask scientists in the 1850s, 1860s, who was the ornithologist of the day in the United States, most of them would say Spencer Baird. Then he had a couple of proteges. Next slide, please. Among them, Robert Ridgway, who served as the first curator of birds at the Smithsonian, and he worked at the Smithsonian from 1880 until he passed away in 1929. Ridgway was an example of the way many ornithologists found the profession in that time period. He was not college educated. He was self-taught and learned on the job, learned the science of ornithology on the job. Next slide, please. You also had ornithologists like Elliott Cowes, who was a physician by training, but also a person of money. And he was essentially a gentleman ornithologist. He never held a professional ornithology position at an organization, although he was affiliated with Harvard and some other museums. Next slide, please. The publications these men produced were mostly technical in nature. In the 1850s, late 1850s, the #1 authoritative bird guide of North America was Volume 9 of the Pacific Railroad Reports. You can see the official lengthy title there at the bottom of your screen, but it was known as Volume 9 of the Pacific Railroad Reports. And these reports were produced from government surveys that had gone out west in the western United States to look for routes for a proposed transcontinental railroad. And in addition to geologists and survey personnel, it was Spencer Baird at the Smithsonian who attached naturalists to these survey parties. And these naturalists sent back all of their specimens that they collected during these years-long surveys of the West. And Baird cataloged those into the museum holdings. And he also, to produce Volume 9, for example, of the railroad reports, Baird also included birds that were found only in the eastern US and birds that he knew were in the West, but his survey naturalist failed to report. So the result was this monumental book on North American birds. Next slide, please. And I love this great quote about the railroad reports from Elliott Cowes. He writes in one of his bird guides in 1882 that Volume 9 was an epic-making work bearing the same relation to the times that the respective works of Audubon and Wilson had sustained in former years. Next slide, please. Of course, Cowes published also a bird guide, and it went through multiple editions. Here's an example from his Key to North American Birds in 1894. These books were lightly illustrated and contained mostly text of very scientific description of birds. Next, please. Ridgway also published a counterpart book. He called his manual the Manual of North American Birds, and here's an example of Ridgway's book. And so if you were interested in birds as a layperson, especially as a scientist, but even as a layperson in the 1870s, 1880s, these were the books that you would use, and they were meant, for the most part, to have the bird in hand. Whether you would shoot the bird and then you would have it in hand to identify it. Next slide, please. Ridgway, Cowes, Baird, and other ornithologists formed the American Ornithologists Union in 1883. They specifically excluded amateurs from full membership. They were given associate membership status, and it was a second-tier non-voting membership. Next, please. The Journal of the American Ornithologists Union was and is the AUK. It's still published, and this is a title, an image of the cover issue of Volume 1, Issue 1. And I should note that the AUK here is, and along with all of the other books that I mentioned, are from the Linda Hall Library's collection. Next slide, please. In 1883, the American Ornithologists Union did not delve into bird protection. That came a year later in 1884. the ornithologists formed a committee for the protection of North American birds and eggs in response to what they saw was the wholesale slaughter of birds, particularly of shorebirds along the coast for the fashion industry to make women's hats. And although many ornithologists supported conservation causes, they also defended their right to obtain specimens for scientific purposes. Robert Ridgway, in the introduction of his Birds of North and Middle America in 1901, I think succinctly summarizes the distinction that was drawn between scientists and amateurs. And he writes that there are two essentially different kinds of ornithology: systematic or scientific, and popular. Popular ornithology is the more entertaining, with its savor of the wildwood, green fields, the riverside and seashore, bird songs, and the many fascinating things connected with out-of-door nature. But systematic ornithology, being a component part of biology, the science of life, is the more instructive and therefore more important. Next slide, please. And with this self-importance of scientific ornithology, as I mentioned, the ornithologists defended their right to collect specimens, and I think this is a great example of the state of mind of science and the environment in the late 19th century. These images are from an article titled "The Home of the Ivory Bill," which Ridgway published in the journal The Osprey in November 1898. And the article describes his trip to Florida, where he spent 2 months in the Big Cypress swamps near Fort Myers, Florida, to obtain ivory-billed woodpeckers for the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum collection. So here was an ornithologist acknowledging that the ivory-billed woodpecker is near extinction. Today, if that happens, if ivory-bills were rediscovered, there would be a great conservation effort to protect the habitat, protect and restore the species. But 1898, Ridgway's thought was, they're going extinct, I better get me some for the museum. He knew the bird was scarce. He had made 2 previous trips to Florida, and he had found no trace of the ivory-billed woodpecker. But this time, after a month in the field, his party spotted 2 nesting pairs. Ridgway and his companion shot both males, but they were disappointed. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to locate and shoot the females. Next slide, please. And then here's a close-up of that bottom picture from the previous slide. And this shows Ridgway in the swamp with it's a little hard to make out, but he's got a rifle in the crook of his arm, and he has a dead male ivory-billed woodpecker in hand. And the quote there at the bottom of the picture: "A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush." And of course, Ridgway was not alone. Museums collect specimens, and they actually collect specimens to this day. And here's a great shot of photo by the famous photographer Chip Clark of the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian, part of the bird collection. You can just see the volume of the bird species there. Next slide, please. Now the amateurs. Ridgway talked about the difference between professionals and popular ornithology, the amateurs. Who were these amateurs? Next, please. The amateurs in the latter part of the 19th century were in large part hobbyists interested in collecting. And what most bird enthusiasts collected during this time were bird eggs, and some people collected nests. And there were journals published, the Oologist, next please, and the Nidologist, the study of nests. And here's an example of an advertisement. And from the nidologist, and these journals would facilitate the education of how to identify eggs, how to find them, and then it would facilitate the buying and selling and trading of eggs. And here's just a great example of a price list of southern birds' eggs in the fine original sets with careful data. Next slide, please. And you can see if you had an egg collection and you were missing some of these species, you could send off and pay $2, for example, for 5 sets of dusky seaside sparrow eggs. The American Ornithologists Union I mentioned this earlier, that they were concerned about the millinery trade, the use of bird feathers, and sometimes whole birds in women's fashions, especially for hats. And you can see here, this photo from the National Audubon Society, a woman, I don't know the species of that bird, but you can see not just the feathers, but she has the entire bird sitting on the top of her head. Next, please. In 1886, Frank Chapman, remember Frank Chapman was the originator of the Christmas bird count when he was an ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He spent 2 afternoons walking around town, and he identified 174 birds and 40 species on women's hats. It included wings, heads, tails, or entire bodies of 3 bluebirds, 2 red-headed woodpeckers, 9 Baltimore Orioles, 5 blue jays, common terns, owls, and a prairie hen. Next, please. So with this great concern among people about the protection of birds, George Bird Grinnell, he was editor of Forest and Stream magazine. Next slide, please. In 1886, Grinnell proposed that formation of an association for the protection of wild birds and their eggs, and he named the organization the Audubon Society. He felt that Audubon did a great job with his artwork of promoting an interest in birds, so he wanted to identify the society with Audubon's name. He established it as a free membership to everyone, and he listed 3 objectives, and they are to prevent, as far as possible, the killing of any wild birds not used for food, the destruction of nest or eggs of any wild bird, and the wearing of feathers as ornaments or trimming for dress. And he published this in his journal, Forest and Stream, in 1886. Next slide, please. Then within a year, the Audubon Society had over 300 chapters and 18,000 members. And he began selling Audubon magazine at 50 cents a year in an attempt to generate revenue for the organization. Next, please. And here's a cover issue of volume 1, number 1, from February 1887. Next, please. It was short-lived, though. The business model really didn't work. Subscriptions failed to provide the necessary financial resources to fund the association, and within 3 years, membership dried up, and the first attempt at the Audubon Society went out of business. Next, please. It was during the 1880s and 1890s, in addition to an attempt to create the first Audubon Society, that the first bird books, the first early field guides were published in an attempt to change people's minds. Instead of hunting birds with guns, instead of collecting eggs, to go out into the woods and just view nature, view birds, view their nest without destroying them. This was also a period when binoculars and cameras were becoming more accessible and available to the general public, especially late in the 19th century. One of the authors of early bird books, early bird field guides, was Florence Merriam Bailey, known as Florence Merriam, when she published some of her early works. Next slide, please. And here's an example of one of her books. It was titled Birds Through an Opera Glass, published in 1889. It was, written specifically for a lay audience. It included a few illustrations of birds. You can see a blue jay here. Next slide, please. And in the introduction, she states the purpose of her work. She writes, photography is coming to hold an important place in nature work, as its notes cannot be questioned, and the student who goes afield armed with opera glass and camera will not only add more to our knowledge than he who goes armed with a gun, but will gain for himself a fund of enthusiasm and a lasting store of pleasant memories. For more than all the statistics is the sanity and serenity of spirit that comes when we step aside from the turmoil of the world to hold quiet converse with nature. So she was promoting not only a less violent approach to viewing nature, but also it would provide an escape from industrialization that had taken hold in the 19th century. Next, please. Another author during this time period was Mabel Osgood Wright. Next, please. And here's an example of her book, Birdcraft. And this was much more illustrated than Florence Merriam's book. And you can see, they're not quite the same type of illustrations that, you would possibly see with today's bird guides, but it's starting to look like what we would think of as a modern bird field guide. Next, please. And Wright is much more explicit about the intentions of her book and not harming or killing bird species. She writes in her introduction to Birdcraft, "It is to the living bird in his love songs, his house building, his haunts, and his migrations that I would lead you. The gun that silences the bird voice and the looting of nest should be left to the practiced hands of science. You have no excuse for taking life, whether actual or embryonic, as your very ignorance will cause useless slaughter, and the egg-collecting fever of the average boy savors more of the greed of possession than of ornithological ardor." So she was very plain and very explicit in her opinion about the difference between watching birds and those hobbyists who killed birds or collected bird eggs. Next slide, please. 10 years after the first Audubon societies was attempted to form, another attempt at establishing Audubon societies got underway in 1896. Boston socialites Harriet Hemingway, and this is Hemingway pictured here, and Mina Hall founded the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And their goal was similar to Grinnell's vision a decade earlier. They wanted to stop the destruction of non-game birds for women's fashion and just promote the idea of nature as something to enjoy, not to destroy. Next slide, please. Here we meet Frank Chapman again. He was ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And next, please. He became editor of Bird Lore. And Bird Lore became the official publication of the Audubon Societies in 1899 with the motto, "A bird in the bush is worth two in the hand." And within 2 years, 15 other states besides Massachusetts formed Audubon societies. The women organizing and running these early societies were instrumental in expanding mission and vision of the organization. The Audubon movement became one of many social reform organizations in which women could wield political power without yet having a voice at least at the federal ballot box. By 1905, the Audubon movement was here to stay. The National Association of Audubon Societies for the Protection of Wild Birds and Animals incorporated that year. Again, that was 1905. and it became the National Audubon Society in 1940. And of course, as we know, it continues to be a leading voice for conservation today. Next slide, please. And then to go back to that 1900, I recap some of this. There were 25 Christmas bird counts, 27 birders, mostly in the Northeast US, 90 species. And today, next slide, please. This was last year's Christmas bird count. There were 2,621 counts, which was second only to the 120th Christmas bird count that had over 2,600 counts. There were over 76,000 participants in the US, Canada, Latin America, Caribbean, and Pacific Islands, and there were 672 species seen in the Christmas bird counts in the US. A little bit of a jump from 122 years earlier. Next slide, please. How is this data used? There's still perhaps a distinction between scientists and amateur bird watchers, but certainly data, it's been decades now that the importance of data from citizen science projects like the Christmas bird count have been understood as having great scientific value. The Christmas bird count data has been used in the Audubon Society's climate change report that came out a few years ago, one of the most important climate change reports to be published, that showed the great decline in the number of birds in North America. Christmas bird count data has also been used in the EPA's climate change publication, reports by the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then the Audubon's Common Birds in Decline report. And one of the fun, or not fun, but interesting websites to go to is at audubon.org. and /conservation /where have all the birds gone. And this is an interactive map that shows the decline of birds. You can zoom in on a particular state, on a particular species, and look at population declines of many North American birds. Next slide, please. And the first bird count, I just wanted to situate kind of, where that fell in, along with some other environmental and conservation initiatives around the late 19th century, early 20th century. Of course, the Audubon Society I mentioned was founded in 1896. It was first attempted in 1886. The Sierra Club formed in 1892. The Forest Management Act, known as the Organic Act, 1897. One of the first wildlife, the most important, one of the first important wildlife protection acts, the Lacey Act, was passed in 1900, same year as the first Christmas bird count. And then, as I mentioned, the National Audubon Society was incorporated in 1905. And then you also had, of course, in that date range was the National Park Service. I think began late 1870s. I think the National Park Service itself formed early part of the 20th century. Next slide, please. So thank you. That's a little bit of history about how the first Christmas bird count came about, and we have plenty of time for questions, and there is one more bird quiz. Next slide, please. If you could identify that, you could throw that in chat. It's another bird you might see if you're on a Christmas bird count here in the Kansas City area. Oh, this is a little more difficult. It's got the Mahomes haircut, I think. Someone said common merganser. It's a female hooded merganser. So you're on the right track there. I think there was also a question in chat about, was Mina Hall related to Herbert and Linda Hall? Not that I know of. I've found no relation between Mina Hall and Lyndon Herbert Hall. Herbert Hall was originally from South Paris, Maine, and Linda Hall grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and they both found their way to Kansas City as young people. Met here, married, and they were in the grain business, and they left their property and the bulk of their estate to create the Linda Hall Library. What does a bird in the bush is worth two in the hand mean? It means, you know, it's more, there's more value in looking at a bird, you know, seeing it in a tree in the bush, than actually killing it, or killing two of them and having them in hand. Of course, that was the opposite of the way Ridgway described his hunt for the ivory-billed woodpecker, where he talked about how a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. It was a play on that saying. The bird is a female hooded merganser. The male you can Google this, just hooded merganser. The male is very brightly colored. Female, I think, still a great looking bird, but just more earth tone colors. Right? Is there any information about nocturnal bird counts? You know, I don't know of specific nocturnal bird counts, but I do know that the Christmas bird count, it's each count, it's a designated place, a designated 15-mile diameter. There are, it's a 24-hour count. So there are many birders on those counts that do go out overnight, and that's in some ways that's the best way to identify and count those nocturnal birds such as owls. You got to get out before the sun gets up, and stay out after dark. I think it was a little, there's a question about did the birds as ornaments on women's hats signify anything regarding societal functions? Does it regard wealth, or was it more just a fashion statement? It was part of both. Certainly, it was a fashion of that era, but it was a lot of wealthy women wearing the hats and the ornate displays on their heads. And it's similar to the question there. It was I think more the wealthy women wearing those hats, but it was also popular. There were how many of the viewers have actually participated in a Christmas bird count? Yeah, I'd be curious to know. I have. It's been a number of years since I've participated in a bird count, but yeah, drop it in chat if you participated in one. I used to participate in several every year. I grew up in Illinois, and that's where I participated in most of the bird counts. It's quite a fun day if you like birds, you like bird watching, and you don't have to be an expert birder either. If you contact your local Audubon Society, they will, and if you're interested in participating in a bird count, they will pair you with someone who's more expert than you if you don't feel like you're an expert identifying birds. And for those of you in the Kansas City area, my colleague Christina will drop the Burroughs Audubon Society of Greater Kansas City link, and there it is, burroughs.org. That's a link to the local Kansas City chapter of the Audubon Society. Weren't fleas a problem with hats? I haven't read anything about that, but I would suspect that they would be. And I don't know how the birds were preserved, especially not just feathers, but entire birds were unhatched, you think fleas or other insects would have been a problem. I don't know. David writes that David's been on one Christmas bird count. If there's anyone from the Audubon Society here, they could chime in. Is there a possibility that there was misidentification of birds, which would allow a miscalculated sense? Probably over the course of a bird count, there are misidentified birds, but I think with the great number of people out observing birds, and most bird counts, you're in a team. So you're just not a solo participant out there. So the chances of misidentifying something decreases when you have other people with you if you're not sure about a bird. And so it would probably be 2 or 3 or 4 people would have to misidentify something. So I would say, it's probably very little misidentification in bird counts. Certainly, question, did climate change or any similar factors affect the bird count? It certainly has. There has been a great decrease in the number of North American birds, and climate change has been attributed in great part to that. And if you go back to that, you can search the National Audubon Society's website. It's a climate report. I believe it was published in 2019, perhaps 2020. Maybe if someone knows about that, they could post that. But it's a very telling report that describes the decline in North American birds, and that's been observed through the bird counts as well. What year was the best for the annual Christmas bird count? I'm not sure if there's a best year. I think a couple of years ago was the biggest, if that's the definition of best, that had the most participants and the most counts. It was a couple of years ago, I think, as we emerged from COVID. How can a bird count help society? Well, it helps determine the bird populations, and it's directly related to conservation efforts that conservation organizations and governmental organizations work through to protect the environment. Okay, a question. Was it somewhat like a status symbol? I'm probably referring to birds on a hat. I believe so. I believe it was that. The more ornate, the more birds you have on your hat, I'm sure it was a status symbol. And yeah, Scott, thank you for dropping that link in the chat there from the Audubon Society. And thank you everyone for attending. We have a time with kind of last call for questions. How does bird migration affect the Christmas bird count? With the number of counts throughout North America, Central America, especially in the Western Hemisphere, I don't think bird migration necessarily has an effect on the bird count, because there are birders doing counts where birds spend the winter, where they spend the summer. I guess it wouldn't be summer, but where birds spend the winter. So I believe even birds that summer in, say, in the Kansas City area, winter in Central America, those birds are also getting counted by birders down in those countries. How much have invasive species affected native birds? It's a little out of my area of expertise, but I there are certainly problems with invasive species that it's kind of the nature of being an invasive species, that you introduce something that's not native, and it is not good for the native species that are there. And I talked about climate change affecting the number of birds and the bird count. If you look in chat, there's a great article from the Audubon Society about how climate change has affected bird populations. All right, thank you everyone for attending today's program. It's been a lot of fun to talk about birds and the Christmas bird count. For more information about all of our upcoming events at the Linda Hall Library, visit lindahall.org. For information about all of the great events at the Kansas City Public Library, visit kclibrary.org.